Oh, hello and welcome. Welcome to another meeting in a series of G2H2 hosted policy debates. It's the second last one. It will go, let's say, until 5 minutes to 4 o'clock Central European summertime, because it's back to the next session that will start at 4 o'clock. The topic is banking on health, the surging pandemic of health financialization, a topic proposed by our member Society for International Development, with Nicoletta Dentico in the lead. And she's also the one who is there for answering all your inquiries that are related to the topic. You see the email address on our website, but also here on the slide. For this session, we will have interpretation available in English, French, and Spanish. So if you want to benefit from interpretation, please select your language in the interpretation through the interpretation button that you will find on your Zoom device, which is set up in different ways according to the device you use. For general inquiries about G2H2, who we are, what we do, please reach out to me. You know, we as G2H2, we want to provide a space for talking, for discussing, for meeting, for sharing knowledge, and also for doing politics together, advocacy together on matters that are important to our members and important also to advance democracy within this difficult space of international health. Just an overlook at where we are with the series. So we are close to closing with today's session, and we had already quite a dense and intensive program of meetings over the week. So thanks again to Society for International Development and to Nicoletta for hosting the session. Please, all of you, if you want at a certain moment, if you want to engage in the conversation, you can do this by raising your hand, and then the session moderator will tell you that you can speak, and I will unmute you, and then this is done. The session is kindly moderated by Priti Patnaik, journalist, hosting the Geneva Health Files, which is a great website and a great resource for all of us who are dealing with international health and with also all those Geneva and World Health Organization related processes. So without further ado, I hand over to Priti, who will welcome you again and guide you through this session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We welcome you to this exciting afternoon to discuss the brave new world of financialization, securitization, going from mere private sector involvement in health to how development can make money for the private sector. And we are discussing this in a week where, member states of the WHO are considering the replenishment approach for World Health Organization. We have a great set of panelists today. As Thomas mentioned, Nicoletta from the Society of International Development steering this. And also joining us is Maria José Romero from Eurodad, Marco Angelo from Wemos, Attiya Waris, the UN Independent Rapporteur on Foreign Debt and Human Rights, Antoine de Bengy from University of Oslo, who's an expert on international relations and global health governance. So we will basically go through our panelists, and they will have 10 minutes each to present. And then we will have space and time for questions and interventions. Thanks so much for joining us. And without further ado, I hand over to Nicoletta for a scintillating introduction to this topic.
Thank you very much, Priti, and thank you all for helping me organize and pull together this panel and this discussion today, which of course is very important for SID, for Society for International Development, which I represent here. And it is so great to see this very competent group of researchers and panelists that I'm really indebted to in the work that I did in the last few weeks for the policy briefing that we are trying to launch today. In fact, it's a quasi-policy briefing because we have decided that we would like to take also stock of this conversation before ending the packaging of this working document. as we are indeed indebted to many of the competencies in this panel, we would also recognize that the value of this policy briefing is also because this instrument is the output and the legacy of different communities, the financial community, the global health community. In other words, it's the harvest of collective intelligence that I simply wanted to put together, update, and put it with the classical, collective, generalistic and systemic vision that SID tries to pursue in its work. So my gratitude to all of you whose research is so important for my writing. Now, as we illustrate in this document, in the policy briefing, financialization of health is a complex phenomenon, a very sophisticated manifestation of what we could call, in a way, the profit civilization of our times, of this globalized economy. And second, it has quite a history. And it was important for me to go back to that history because many people don't know where all this comes from. And especially in the health domain, health financialization has, I would say, emerged as a very strong reaction to the spirit and the aspirations of the Alma Ata Conference and the Alma Ata Declaration in 1978. This political horizon of health for all by year 2000, through the idea even of a new economic order, was rapidly intercepted in a way as a danger and was rapidly hijacked by important and very powerful and conservative governments in the international community and market-oriented players, which in a way overturned the sense of direction of Alma Ata towards the disorder of a deregulated, globalized economy. That's when, I mean, at the beginning of the beginning of the 80s, actually, that's when we have started to see the introduction of, and then with the World Bank report of investing in health exactly 30 years ago, we have started to see the introduction of strict economic criteria for priority setting and policy making in the domain of public health. Now, one thing I want to say is that the WHO continues to talk about Alma Ata. However, it seems that they don't understand that this political vision is not compatible with the recipes that the WHO continues to administer, which is basically continuing, like other actors of the international development community, to produce and to propose the idea that the private sector is a key player to go, and that WHO doesn't seem to realize that health for all doesn't go hand in hand with the progressive dismantling of the state functions or with the profit maximization that is needed to be granted for investors to come on board. So there are some sort of policy contradictions, which I think it's important, and civil society does that, to go through and deconstruct a little bit, because Alma Ata meant policy intervention at the public level with a serious constitutional agenda of governments. So what do we mean when we speak about health financialization? Of course, financialization has several definitions. I have taken one, the definition that is overall most cited. And financialization refers to the increasing role of financial motives, financial markets, financial actors, and financial institutions in the operation of domestic and international economies. This happens, through privatization, deregulation, credit flows. It has a variety of actors and a variety of ways in which financialization is actually pursued, the creation of new asset classes, the institutionalization of medical knowledge monopolies, as we have seen in the WTO agenda, the expansion of markets and financial techniques applied to healthcare insurance schemes, the capitalization of development aid, and in the specific case of health, I think that financialization is also pursued through the mere biomedical approach that we have seen over the last 20 years, and that is so tragically pursued also after 3 years of COVID and supposed COVID lessons. So financialization has a complex, a series of elements that go with it. And of course, it is important, as we discussed before this webinar, to separate financialization from privatization and from health financing. These are three separate domains. This is very true. But at the same time, I think you will agree with me that it is difficult also to, clearly separate these blurred lines, because the three arenas are also intersecting very much. What do I mean? I mean that, of course, financialization in the health domain is conducted through privatization strategies. It is conducted through the intrusion of the private sector in what used to be a predominantly run public domain. And of course, it also is part of the financing for health agenda, because as Maria José and Marco will explain to us, it is actually the very public, multilateral public financing players that are proposing financialization as a way to support health, with the excuse that public funding is not sufficient to respond to the needs of the Sustainable Development Agenda, also given the sharp increase on financing needs that has come after COVID for the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. So in a way, financialization today is in a way the goal and also the outcome of development finance, as we will see. And health is no exception. And of course, it is got to do with the use of public funding to the risk, incentivize, share the burden of potential risks for private investors. So I have a question here that I would like, to throw to when the WHO today, as we see in the negotiations for the pandemic treaty, or the pandemic accord, has a financialization chapter that actually asks correctly for more public funding for health, we should have two questions attached to this claim, which is a right claim. A, where is this public funding, especially for many countries, coming from, given all the dependencies, the financial dependencies that countries have to the multilateral financial institutions? And two, what is going to be the use of this public funding? Because if the public funding is going to be used for private investments, then we have a bit of a problem. Now, the pandemic has come as a bit of a providential event, I think, for a financial player and for triggering a new stage of health financialization. We see an increasing number of financial actors coming on board or even strengthening their positions. And I'm not just referring to asset managers, to the commercial banks, which were even included in the COVAX or in the ACT, accelerator, accelerator for COVID remedies. We will discuss it later. Hedge funds or insurance companies. It is the strengthening and the pervasiveness more and more of, for example, private foundations, which we'll discuss later, and consultancy firms that are now leading this agenda in a very in a very clear and ingenious manner, with a lot of ingenuity, because they are actually developing now new tropes of financialization in pandemic times, which goes perfectly well with this immunopolitics agenda that is being, when immunity is the new organizing principle that is coming with also the discussions and the negotiations being held during at the World Health Organization. And of course, I did not indulge too much into this aspect of financialization that we have seen during the pandemic, because much has been written about this. But we have seen a major drive of health financialization, of what I would call hyper-financialization during the pandemic, deriving from the monopoly rights of vaccines producers. During COVID, financialization has not only been manifested through the fact that vaccine producers, pharma producers have actually shaped their financial pockets during the pandemic, increasing the number of billionaires and ripping off incredible profits. But it also demonstrated how financialization can be risky in the governance structures of global public health, because we have seen the consequences of the relationship that has emerged between government's public function and the private interests that were at stake during an emergency situation. We have seen what Professor Dosi of the Pisa University calls a sort of reversal of the relationship between the public and the private, with the private not only holding the reins of the conditions for producing the vaccines, but also politically being so powerful in making it impossible for the political measure of the IP waiver to be actually, approved, to be coming as a solution to pluralize R&D and pluralize the manufacturing of not just vaccines, but all the remedies that were needed during COVID-19. So now, as the policy briefing started to explain, we are moving to a new stage in a way, the stage which is financialization plus, so to speak, with the World Bank Evolution Roadmap document that was released at the beginning of 2023, where we can see that there is a temptation, a formidable temptation towards securitization of the development agenda. Securitization, which is basically, moving from concessional loans to commercial loans, and also exasperating further the market speculation possibilities to impact and intervene into the global health agenda. In health, we have seen securitization already. We have seen it we see it with several social impact bonds that have been created with the Millennium Development Goals, with the Sustainable Development Goals, and also with the later pandemic bonds that started with Ebola in 2014. It was the creation of these pandemic bonds, borrowing from the catastrophe bonds. But neither social impact bonds nor pandemic bonds have actually harvested the promised results. And in fact, the Ebola bonds have raised, maybe we have time later to go a little bit deeper into this, have raised enormous criticisms for clearly, profiling the advantage of investors who managed to gain a lot of money out of the trigger mechanism, a very rigid trigger mechanism that did not help Ebola patients at all. And then we have, of course, a successful bond, a successful or presumably successful securitization mechanism, the vaccine bond IFIM, International Financial Facility for Immunization, which is a global scheme that goes through Gavi, And the policy briefing tries to reproduce a very important study that the Cambridge University has carried out following the money of IFIM, or at least following the numbers that are available of IFIM. That also must be said, to show that IFIM is not the success story that is usually marketed, that IFIM and vaccination immunizations comes with extremely important burdens on the public sector and extremely high rates of gains for the private sector. And it also creates a very serious geographical disparities among those that have conceived the idea of the vaccine bond and those that should be receiving the benefits of this vaccine bond that are not to be seen anywhere in the governance setup of IFIM. So I finish here just to say why it was important for us to focus on the International Financial Facility for Immunization, because with the crisis and the many criticisms that came to pandemic bonds in the last few years, the international community is now looking at IFIM as a possible success story to repeat for other health arenas. And that is something that we really need to monitor in the context of the World Bank Pandemic Fund, because we know that the pandemic fund that is also part of the WHO pandemic treaty negotiation has not yet clearly revealed how the money of the donors will be used. But considering what the World Bank's philosophy is about development finance, it is highly unlikely that this money will be public money used for public purposes. We have a serious risk that we will see again public money used for private interest profits. And so we definitely need to develop an alternative agenda to this. It is possible, and this group of people, I think, are the companions with whom we need to create to deconstruct the official narratives, but also to bring the evidence of how dysfunctional and how dramatic, in a way, how tragic this policy option is by the multilateral institutions. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you, Nicoletta, for delineating health privatization and health financing. And I would urge the audience to check out the policy briefing as well associated with this event. So just in terms of clarity for our participants and the audience, we'll first go over to Maria, then Marco, and then we go over to Antoine, and finally we'll have Attiya suggest solutions, to achieve financial justice reform. All right, so it's actually a good segue from where Nicoletta left off. We'll turn to Maria from Eurodad. Maybe you can sort of focus your intervention on the role of the World Bank as a health market maker and a facilitator for health financialization, and perhaps touch upon public-private partnerships. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Priti, Nicoletta, and Society for International Development for inviting me to participate in this session. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. And as Priti mentioned in her introduction, I would like to talk to you today about the rise of public-private partnerships in development and the financialization of healthcare. And I will be focusing on the role of the World Bank, as well as what I call health market maker. I will also start by saying a couple of words about the changing narratives and practices of development finance pre and post COVID-19 pandemic. I will get into the issue of the role of the World Bank, and I will also focus on the role of PPPs, public-private partnership, as they are being presented as a silver bullet for development. I will also expand on this to share with you some thoughts coming from our research on the impact of PPPs on the right to health, and I will conclude. Okay, so starting from the changing narratives and practices of development finance, what we have seen is that over the last decade, there has been a private turn in development finance. This has been very, very evident after the 2008 financial crisis, but even more after the 2015 agreement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And these have had significant implications for the universalization of health provision. There has been a strong narrative promoted by multilateral organizations, but also major governments, rich country governments, that claims that the Sustainable Development Goals require massive investment, which is true, and the public finance is not enough, which can be contested. On that basis, there is a narrative being developed around a financing gap that needs to be filled. And because public finance it's presented as a very limited resource, this gap needs to be filled with private finance. And there you are, the concept of leveraging, which is the issue of using public resources, taxpayers' money, also official development assistance, and official institutions as well to leverage private finance, to de-risk private finance or mobilize private finance, call it the way that you prefer. But this is a political choice. This is not a given. This is not the only game in town. This is a political choice that reflects the unwillingness of the international community to scale up and strengthen public financing of development, including by meeting international agreed commitments to deliver 0.7 in aid, tackling international tax avoidance and evasion effectively, agreeing on mechanism for debt cancellation and debt restructuring. Just today, Oxfam reported that wealthy G7 countries owe low and middle income countries 13.3 trillion in unpaid aid and funding for climate action. This is a massive figure, and this it's not being considered at the time of promoting a narrative that it's focusing on a financing gap that only private finance is able to fill. Then what we have, this was present with us pre-COVID. In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic came, and it exposed the impacts of decades of austerity policies and privatization strategies, which undermined public health systems, fueling the dramatic global fallout from the pandemic. Then, sorry, in February 2022, the war in Ukraine started. And then what we had in the world and we have experienced since then, it's the spillover effect of that war, with effects or problems that were there before but intensifying since then. So what many have been calling a polycrisis: food, energy, debt crisis, inflation, on top of a climate crisis and increasing inequalities within and across countries. So while we have seen calls for reform and ambitious responses since the start of the COVID pandemic, actions from MDBs and international communities have fallen short and have even reinforced previous problematic narratives and practices, including a reliance on private finance. The World Bank has sized the crisis as an opportunity to intensify its promotion of private finance. And now there is a renewed rational fiscal headroom, and debt capacity of developing countries post-crisis is even more constrained than before. And this is the argument to go for promoting private solutions. Here you are, the role of the World Bank. And as I said, I think that thinking about the World Bank as a health market maker through the promotion of PPPs, but even beyond that, it's a good way of placing the World Bank in this context. Over the years, the World Bank has played multiple and complementary roles in support of an agenda focused on increasing private sector participation in healthcare, particularly through PPPs, but not only, using different forms of influence, financial, advisory services, general, what they call knowledge production, and governance. So the World Bank has been doing that through different means, promoting market-led sectorial reforms in the health sector, shaping the national regulatory framework to attract private finance, supporting through finance specific health PPPs, in-country project and global health PPPs, but also supporting private equity funds that invest in the health sector. Then it's also the case that it has exerted over the years, and Nicoletta referred to that, it has exerted a strong influence in global health policy with managerial economic ideas, promoting an agenda around what works, right, by seeking to institutionalize its narrative. Then IFC has also played a very important and influential role, focusing now on creating markets in the health sector, finding bankable projects, profitable projects. The example of Kenya, it's a very good example, where the World Bank has been doing most of the things that I mentioned, and where the promotion of increased private participation in healthcare match private actor interest in expanding the role in Kenyan healthcare with support from donor agencies, right? So in the context of, in the post-COVID context, this health market maker role has not stopped. It has intensified, and we have seen this through different research outputs that Eurodad and many others, including Oxfam, recently highlighted. I will not get into the roadmap, evolution roadmap, but Nicoletta already mentioned some of these. I will just focus a little bit more on PPPs because they are promoted as the way by which health goals are going to be delivered, right? And the assumption is that PPPs may help overcome some of key challenges, including insufficient funds, because PPPs are a mechanism, a long-term mechanism by which private sector companies replace the state as a provider of traditional public services, but we are talking about very long-term contracts by which the state gets locked into this agreement with private providers. But PPPs, it's important to that we pay attention to them and to the promotion of PPPs because they can be seen as a wedge, right, in how the policy space around public service provision is being redefined, with important repercussions over and above the relatively small immediate financial significance, right? And there is some academic literature that points to that with empirical research. And this is the role that I mentioned of the World Bank before, right? When it comes to shape the regulatory framework. And this is there, it's more than a single project here or there. So effort to promote PPPs point to clear attempts to increase the involvement of private finance in development, and we should be mindful of that and their implications for the right to health. And here we go, Eurodad, together with many other organizations, last year in December published a report, the second in a series called History Repeated 2, Why PPPs Are Not the Solution. And this report compiles different case studies across the world, covering different sectors. But in particular, when it comes to the right to health, we think that PPPs bring different challenges, starting from the fact that they come with high fiscal and human cost. All too often, PPPs are very expensive, very risky, and this has resulted in a questionable diversion of public resources. PPPs in the health sector introduce commercial imperatives that can undermine the right to health, and women are often the ones that suffer the most, right? Then PPPs, and I will get into this very briefly, just to say that PPPs constitute not only privatized health, but financialized health as well, right? Because some of the players that get into the deals, into the private consortium that manage a PPP project, are financial actors, are not just private health providers, right? They are financial actors. And this translates into a reality where financial players are powerful enough to influence the type of healthcare available to people in need. So the process of financialization, it's very important, and as Nicoletta invited us to look at, we should be mindful of the implications, because this extends the value capture to the health sector, with significant implications for health inequalities. I will just conclude saying that the promotion of PPPs in healthcare contribute to increasing the exposure of national healthcare systems, which, as I mentioned before, has been historically undermined by austerity policies and privatization strategies, to globalized finance, with significant implications for health equity. It is critical to strengthen public health systems and remove financial barriers to accessing health, including health user fees, and it's a missed opportunity that we have not get into the COVID, out of the COVID pandemic with that. Mobilizing domestic resources would offer a genuine choice in financing healthcare and public services more broadly. And we need systemic solutions, right? We don't need false solutions, and we don't need a quick fix. So I will leave the systemic solutions for later in the discussion, but I just wanted to emphasize that. And we raise a call to action to all concerned with justice, equality, sustainability, to challenge the promotion of PPPs, challenge the very problematic role that the World Bank has been playing in making of health a market, breaking the silos that we sometimes have between different communities, because the right to health must be upheld. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. At this point, I'll just draw your attention also to something that's mentioned in the policy brief, a recent report, WHO report on PPPs, where it acknowledges that obligations created by PPPs for the public sector, there are implications on debt. They cannot be legally avoided or adjusted, and therefore undermine the financial sustainability of health systems. All right, so we are actually lagging behind on time a little bit, so I would urge the following speakers to hasten a little bit more. We go over to Marco, and he's going to talk to us about development assistance funding, the trade and aid agenda, and also the role of financial intermediaries. I don't know whether you'll have time, but if you could also sort of touch upon the difference between blended finance and PPPs, that would be great, or we come back to that, in the discussion. Thanks, Marco.
Thank you. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
All right.
Just put it full screen, please.
Yes.
So, thank you.
Thank you, Priti. And it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm gonna focus, as mentioned, on financialization, the relationship with development finance, blended finance, and the role of the IFC. The IFC, I have, for the ones of you who don't know, is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. It has a huge portfolio, also in health. Right now, an active portfolio of 3.5 billion. Basically, the IFC invests. Last year, I did a breakdown of IFC investment in the health sector. Most of the investments of the IFC goes into manufacturing of drugs, vaccines, medical equipment, which is like the most logical areas for private investment, right? But the problem is that the rest goes into a bit more controversial areas. We have 20% of investments, more or less, that goes to private healthcare provisions, 12% of investments that goes to financial intermediaries, which are basically equity funds that then invest in private healthcare with little to no oversight. 2% of the investments that goes into private insurances, and 3% which goes into PPPs. Actually, the investments in PPPs seem very little, but most of the PPP projects are advisory projects. So there is not much money, but there is a big influence on governments. This is the IFC, and to explain what's the role of the IFC in promoting financialization, as MJ explained very well before me, I want to start by explaining that the way it's framed is that there are governments who don't have resources and financial investors who are looking for opportunities of investment. And what the IFC really does is to generate financial assets where investors can put their money and get interest or dividends or sort of financial returns from their investments. And these investments are supposed to contribute to UHC. Instead of addressing a inequality in the distribution of finances, what the IFC does is try to lure in private investors. This is the distinctive aspect of financialization, right? The generation of financial assets that provide returns. And this can be done through PPPs. As we know, PPPs are actually owned by shareholders and give dividends to shareholders. It can be done through development impact bonds, through blended finance, which we will see later, or simply by giving money to investment funds that then invest their money into the healthcare sector. The IFC has a role in all these areas that I highlighted with the red arrow. It provided advisory services to government to set up PPPs, and it invests in investment funds, and it sets up blended finance facilities. I want to focus a little bit on blended finance because I think it's important. It's a new area where the World Bank is operating, and all started with the IDA private sector window. So for those who don't know, the IDA, the International Development Association, is the arm of the World Bank that lends money to the poorest countries. And in 2017, IDA decided that it was necessary to invest a bit more in high-impact private sector investments. So it decided to give part of its money to the IFC, which would then mobilize private investments through a mechanism that's called blended finance, which basically is a mechanism to de-risk private investment in order to lure in investors into many areas, not just health, but also education, infrastructure, climate adaptation. In 2020, actually during COVID-19, the blended finance started to operate into the healthcare sector. And the blended finance basically works like this. So we have financial institutions, banks, investment funds who want to invest into healthcare, but they don't do it because it's too risky. So what this blended finance tries to do is to remove this risk by providing guarantees to investors, so investors can comfortably put their money into private healthcare and get financial returns. The first project of blended finance is called the Africa Medical Equipment Facility in Kenya. It started in Kenya. Actually, now it's expanding in Cote d'Ivoire, and the intention is to expand it in many regions of East Africa. And what it does is basically provides de-risking to banks to give money to private providers to buy medical equipment. And also provides consultancy, advisory services to facilitate this loan process. So the idea is really to scale up investment in private healthcare in the countries where the AMEF is operating. How it was presented was that the AMEF was supposed to invest in low-end providers, small care, primary care, so that needed a little bit of financing to buy equipment from local manufacturers. What we did in a study that we did together with a local civil society organization is to go to Kenya and to actually ask the private providers and the financial institutions involved who is actually benefiting from this. And what we found out is that it's actually financing high-end large hospitals that are expensive, that are aimed to upper middle classes, and it's actually involving only manufacturers at the moment from the European Union and the US, General Electric and Philips. So yeah, my final remarks is, as it's been already said, is that financialization is actually actively pushed by development institutions and the World Bank in particular, and that rather than addressing gaps in development finance, it actually creates opportunities for investors to gain money through development assistance. I hope I didn't go over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Over to you.
I really appreciate this. A lot of granular details from the country level. Here, I would just mention that in the context of sustainable financing discussions at the WHO, innovative financing mechanisms have also been suggested. We don't know what this will look like for the WHO, but some of these proposals are definitely on the table. We zoom out a bit from the country level stories to what happened during the pandemic with the ACT Accelerator and COVAX. And Antoine, maybe you can help us understand all the money that was raised for the ACT Accelerator. How did it end up with the private sector? And we'll be happy to go over your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Priti, and thank you so much, Nicoletta and the G2H2 for inviting me today. I'm a PhD fellow at the University of Oslo, and I have to say that I work with a team of colleagues who are called Katarina Storang and Felix Stein. So all of our work we've done a lot of work together, and so I acknowledge that they played a very important role in this research. So what I'm writing my PhD about are global public-private partnerships like Gavi, the Global Fund, or the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI. And so these are partnerships that are, quite different from what we're talked about until now, in the sense that they are global organizations in which the public and the private sector share decision-making power. So it's not concrete projects, it's not building a hospital. But I still think that these global organizations do drive financialization quite a lot. And I wanted to show a couple of examples about how they work and how they foster financialization. So first of all, let me just say that the first point I wanted to make is that these global public-private partnerships do rely on financial markets for their own funding. And that's the case of the International Finance Facility for Immunization, IFIM, that was mentioned a couple of times already. But I just wanted to explain to you how it works in details, just to understand what's the problem with this thing. So let's say you have a donor who would like to give $100 million to Gavi the next 10 years. It could give $10 million every year. But the donor would like to have a big impact right away, for political reasons or whatever. So they decide to use IFIM. And so to do so, they send a letter to IFIM to say, well, we'll commit to pay $10 million every year the next 10 years. What IFIM does then is to go to the financial markets and they sell vaccine bonds. In other words, what IFIM does is to borrow money from the private sector. And in exchange for that, they will get $70 to $85 million right away that it gives to Gavi to fund the program they have on vaccination. And they did that during the pandemic as well for COVAX. But you don't get as much money as you want, because you still have to pay a rent or an interest rate on the loan, and you also IFIM also has to keep a share to cover their administrative fees. So basically there are a lot of money that is gone missing. But why would you do that? Well, the most obvious is to get money right away, like you get a lot of money right away. So in times of crisis like the COVID pandemic, that can be quite handy, rather than spreading it over several years. And there are two more reasons that are allegedly defending IFIM. One is that for countries that have very high interest rate on their sovereign debt, and often I mention Italy or South Africa, can be quite useful to borrow money through an organization like IFIM, where very high rated donors are part of it as well, like Norway or the UK. But I think the best explanation for why it's useful to use IFIM is that it gives the Gavi Secretariat a lot of freedom to decide when to issue vaccine bonds and to get extra cash when they need it. And so it basically gives this administration a lot of power. But the downside of this financialization are quite many. First of all, it's extremely complicated to understand how all of this work. And as Nicoletta mentioned, some colleagues at Cambridge have tried to follow the money, but they really struggled, and it takes a whole PhD, to understand what's going on there. But what they found is that about $900 million have gone to private investors as a rent or a fee for the bonds. And that corresponds to approximately what IFIM gave to Gavi, 30% of it. And so they estimate that it's about 5% return rate on investment for the private sector, which is quite a lot. I mean, definitely more than what I have on my bank accounts. And the second downside, of course, has to do with donor politics, because by pledging money to IFIM for the next 10, 20, or 30 years, a government locks funding to this very kind of way of doing health. So it has very long-term consequences. Let's say your government loses the election and a new one comes with a new majority. Well, they won't be able to change the pledge because it's legally binding. So many argue that this way of funding health is quite undemocratic. But let me just take another example of how financialization work in these global public-private partnerships. And that's that they use these policies themselves to incentivize the private sector. So the way they operate also drives financialization. And so I can just tell a couple of examples from COVAX, which is what I've been studying most for my PhD project. And just to give you a feel about how the financial language has really taken over this operation. So first of all, COVAX gave a lot of direct subsidies. They call it push subsidies to foster the research and development of vaccines, transfer technology, and expand manufacturing capacity. So the aim was to build the world's largest vaccine portfolio, like a financial investment, if you like, to accelerate equity or to catalyze investments. That were all the words that were used. Second of all, COVAX gave a lot of indirect subsidies to the private sector. That's called pool subsidies. And the aim was to guarantee a market to vaccine doses. And so guaranteeing a market has been done in two ways. The first one was to say, well, don't worry, pharmaceutical companies, the countries from the global south will be able to buy vaccines as well, because we're here to help. So that you expand the market geographically by including a lot of countries. And the second way of expanding the market has been to use it's called advanced purchase agreement. So basically you commit to buy doses without knowing whether they are safe and effective or whether you'll be able to go through the entire development project. You just say, I commit to buy these doses, please just expand production capacity, go all on, and we'll pay whatever it takes. And so quite a lot of money has been used to do that, which is, quite smart in crisis time. You have to accelerate production, but it's also a very important way of de-risking the financial risk of pharmaceutical companies. So basically, you can ask at the end of the day, with both these direct and indirect subsidies, how much of risk, financial risk, the companies have been taken, and definitely some haven't taken much, although the profits for many have been quite high. And so I just finish by kind of bringing 5 key takeaways from my research and from these findings on financialization that relate to the way these hybrid or global organizations are governed, the way we work together in there. So first of all, public-private partnerships at the global level, they rely entirely on voluntary cooperation. And it may have some impact with some collaborative-oriented companies, like, for instance, AstraZeneca has been criticized, but they've done quite a lot of effort to scale up production and make their doses accessible to COVAX. So incentivizing this kind of companies can make sense in a way. But when pharmaceutical companies do not work very well with these partnerships and adopt more of an extractive or profit maximizing approach, privileging their shareholders and the stock market over public health, then you end up in trouble, because the whole point of a partnership is to be partners, and you don't sue partners, you don't attack, you don't take legal actions against partners, you basically are toothless. And so you only have carrots to incentivize, give financial investments, but you have no way of taking a stick and trying to come in with more serious threats. The second point I wanted to make is that both financialization and these organizations are extremely opaque and secretive. And that was really challenging to study COVAX at the time. And it still is. And I've been looking at Gavi and these other partnerships for the last, how they've been working the past decade. And even that is difficult. And because there's a lot of non-disclosure agreements, trade secrets. We don't know, for instance, during the pandemic, how much money was paid for the doses, how much subsidies were given, not the conditions that were part of the deal. And so, for instance, one of the key challenge now with COVAX is to try to get some money back from this contract they have for doses. And this talks about over $1.5 billion that are missing somewhere in sitting with the pharmaceutical companies, and that they're trying to negotiate to cancel the contracts. But my point is, we don't know whether they can or not. We don't know whether they can settle a good deal or not, because all of this is secret. And all of this is public money, of course. And relating to my last point, I try to emphasize the financial language. It's extremely widespread in these partnerships. You use a lot of consultants. And this language is a powerful tool to obscure power dynamics and to really understand what's going on and whose interests are being served. And so we recently published a piece called Global Health Nonsense with Catherine Storing and Felix Stein. That
Antoine, we'll have to wrap up soon.
Yeah, I'm almost done. Bullshit bingo with some of these financial terms that can help you identify when financialization processes are going on. And I wanted to maybe conclude with one point, which is that these partnerships are maybe the main vehicle for influence for foundations and donors, because they really control the governance structure. And so that will be discussed more in the next session. But these are organizations that are controlled by a board dominated by donors, whether they are private or public. And low-income countries haven't been engaged sufficiently in the creation of COVAX, as is well known. But because COVAX was so powerful and so good at co-opting the agenda, they really foreclosed other policy alternatives, such as working on patents, such as a TRIPS waiver or working on CTAP. And by doing that, they privatized a financialized approach to patents, which is, financial resources for these companies, rather than a life-saving recipes of vaccines and other products that needs to be shared to the widest degree possible. And that's it for me.
Thanks a lot. There are just two takeaways. One is that really IFHIM is a poster boy for health financing here in Geneva. People keep talking about it, and also the institutionalization of advanced market commitments that Gavi has perfected to an art. All right, we head to Attiya, who has the enviable task of coming up with solutions on the whole transition to financial justice reforms from the set of problems that everyone else has stated. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Priti. It's been a pleasure listening to all of you speak, and quite fascinating trying to pull it together. So you'll be happy to know there is no PowerPoint. It's just a set of 8 interventions, maybe 9. My starting point when it comes to the fiscal elements of it is it's debt, trade, aid, taxation, illicit financial flows, state revenue. So these are your sources at the national level. Debt that we've talked about includes both private and public. We've been playing around those spaces as well. A couple of years ago, I actually wrote an article on the need to have principles of finance in determining how any institution is based. And I specifically looked at the issue of health. And as I continue to work in this space, I think there is a definite need to stick to what I call the principles of fiscal legitimacy. And there are 7 of them. There is transparency in a system, and we've already heard issues around secrecy and agreements that are not accessible. So that's transparency. We've got accountability issues. We've already heard about regimes taking on debt and then handing it over, for example, to the subsequent regime. And if you look at issues around the IMF, debt is often passed on to the next regime, or when a new regime comes in, they extend the life of debt repayment schedules because of that very same problem. They've inherited debt and they really don't know how to pay it off. So that's about accountability and responsibility in that space. And the responsibility in the space is very different between the private sector and the public sector. And we're looking at these rules, but if you hear what everyone is saying, you will see that private investors seem to almost have a separate set of rules, in fact, almost no rules at all, as opposed to public sector, in which case, it's the Bretton Woods institutions, to some extent, have some rules guiding them. But within fiscal legitimacy, there are 2 elements. It's efficiency and effectiveness. And so the issues around efficiency are about how you're collecting, who's making profit, should they make profit, how much does it cost to set these up? Again, we bump up against lack of adequate information on a lot of these issues. And how effective it is, we can only tell afterwards. And I think COVID and that entire process, which frankly, in developing countries, it is still a pandemic, it is still a crisis, and one must remember that. This period of crises has put a lot of the systems under incredible pressure, and issues that were there anyway are now showing themselves a little bit more strongly than they were before. And I think it's important to extract out of it. Some of these are not new issues. They're just issues that were already existing in the system, and now we can see them more clearly through the lens of the pandemic. And then that brings me to fairness and justice. And that actually leads me to the whole issue around human rights and principles of human rights that actually will be perfect in guiding a lot of this. WHO falls under right to health, was set up under right to health auspices. And it's very important to ensure that these very siloed fiscal institutions that we are talking about, whether it is private lenders and Gavi or it is public lenders, that they all follow the same set of principles that these other rights-based entities are supposed to actually grapple with. And it takes me back to the constant problem. So you will have these human rights treaty frameworks, and if we look at health, and they'll say we have to roll out the following under the right to health. At the African Union level, African governments have committed to spending, for example, a minimum of 15% of their budgets on health. But on the other hand, how do they do this if the very same source of funding is actually demanding austerity measures or is guiding those loan conditionalities? And so there is this disconnect all the time. And it actually keeps you keep being tripped up on yourself every single time as you go through this process. And so what are my, some concrete suggestions? I think when we talk about PPPs, I think there's been a refocus by including more stakeholders in the participatory processes, but it means that the traditional stakeholders, whether it's civil society or human beings down at the bottom, unfortunately, their voices do not have the same amount of space as strong lobby groups, consultancies, the private sector. And there is a need for these international institutions to rebalance participation and stakeholder engagement, while being aware that, well, there are PPPs that are not going to go anywhere now and they're embedded in the system. But now that is for the existing ones. But then when they go to the new PPPs that they're considering, it's got to be demand driven. I'm actually on the board of a PPP, which I joined very grudgingly, but I'm very happy to say every single thing that this PPP does is driven. It's called the Capability Foundation. Everything is driven by what developing country states are demanding of my PPP team. And I think that finding that balance is incredibly difficult. It's 5 years where we've been grappling with it, but I think we've been fairly successful. And I think it's also a good example. It's not in health, it's in tax training, but it's still quite interesting. I think that bond repayment schedules should be linked to the existence of a regime period. I mean, this is really controversial, but the problem we are facing in many parts of the world, one country that comes to mind is Argentina, is debt sometimes that was taken 20, 30, 40 years ago. You don't know where the finances have gone to. You cannot see things on the ground to see development. But then on the other hand, this country is having to deal with the debt repayment. And it is the same for countries facing what I will call acts of God, cyclones, where you've taken on debt, but the infrastructure is at the bottom of the sea after a cyclone period. And these are real questions that we're not grappling with. Hospitals are at the bottom of the sea, but the debt is still being repaid by particular countries across the world. So bond repayment schedules need to be very carefully managed. We need to de-link the lending of money from credit rating agencies. Currently, we have got countries in debt crisis, but their debts have been declared as junk status by one of 4 private companies registered in one country in the world. That we are allowing 4 private entities to decide on the value of a country, I find unacceptable. And I think that this is something we really need to deal with. Previous mandate holders to my mandate, Yuf and Lee, actually wrote a report to the General Assembly on what credit rating agencies have been doing. And a lot of these are linked to something else, which I have not heard today. but I think is an important phrase, and that is vulture funds. We've talked about funds, but we haven't talked about the ones that are deliberately trying to be extractive in this process. From my mandate, we have a report on vulture funds as well. And I think it is really important to de-link health from both of these, and pretty quickly. The other issue that I don't think is commonly known is that private bonds or debts are taken on by groups of investors who've already committed and are willing to lose the entire amount. I'm going to say that again. Private bonds are usually taken up by investors who are already willing to lose 100% of the money. Otherwise, this investor would not be sitting in a rich country willing to invest in a seriously poor country somewhere else in the world. And this is the whole basis on which investment companies pull together these investors. So when you hear this whole conversation about de-risking, it's almost a duplicity in the process, because the risk appetite is already there. So if the risk appetite is there, what are we really de-risking? And it's a really big question, which I don't think people are grappling with yet. And they say that it's to do with the repayment of the investment, which I've already heard being discussed. But it means that we need to really interrogate this. And again, absence of information, adequate knowledge, secondary bond markets have no regulations. All of these are different pieces in play that we need to look at. And I think the last 2 points I'm going to make, actually just the last point I'm going to make, is that governments across the world already had emergency funds. COVID hit. I managed to do a study of emergency funds of the African continent. I haven't seen the status of emergency funds across the world, but in an ideal situation, those emergency funds that were in annual budgets should have been accessible for people to use in their countries to actually access the vaccines. What I've not seen also is how those funds were being utilized and where that money has gone. And I think that these questions need to, this is the sort of like the pressure cooker that COVID put us into. These are the issues that we really need to get a lot of clarity on. So I'm gonna stop by saying that there is one solution I believe in. The solution that I believe in is that a lot of the conversations, whether I'm having them in health spaces or tax spaces, debt spaces or education spaces or food spaces, all of them are grappling with very similar principles around finance, but they're siloed into these different expenditure spaces. And I think that the solution is to finally really put our weight behind Nigeria's General Assembly resolution, which is supposed to be resolved by the end of this year, on the creation of a global fiscal body. I mean, they talk about a tax body, but I think we have to widen it. Where do people go for dispute resolution with the bonds if they're unpaid? You go back to the same spaces of the people who are determining them. So all of these elements we're talking about can actually be brought together. And I've heard already in the conversation today about the breaking of the silos. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. Priti, back to you.
Thanks a lot for this cross-cutting perspective. And this conversation would not have been held at a more appropriate time, where countries are talking about de-risking of investments in the context of PPR financing. That's the first thing that you're going to hear from a lot of the big agencies, that how do we de-risk and how do we attract investments to prepare for health emergencies, to basically fund private actors upfront in some sense. All right, so we are actually in the final 10 minutes. The floor is open for questions. Maybe there's one hand up for a long time. Linda, do you want to sort of speak out or put your question in the chat? And I would also urge panelists to ask questions of each other or whatever else is convenient. But final 10 minutes really. Okay, I think a hand has gone down. Anyone else interested to raise a question here? So there's one from Andreas Wolf, to all panelists. Can you comment on the model of global public investment that is being promoted by, Christoph Ben, and as a way forward to move away from traditional ODA and PPP funding. Is it worth exploring? Anyone wants to take a stab at that?
I can take a.
Yeah, please go. Please go.
I just spoke, Maria, please.
Maria, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Okay, thanks for the question. It's a very relevant question, and we have been encountering this initiative several times. What I will say is that there are many initiatives around. Some of them might be more worth exploring than others, but the particular challenge that I see with this one is that it diverts attention from a very long-standing commitment that rich country governments made more than 50 years ago. That comes from the colonial times, and the concept of ODA needs to be or put back to back with reparation, right? And has to be placed into a decolonial conversation that needs to happen. And that's why I raised the finding that Oxfam put out just today that says that G7 countries, low-income countries and developing countries, a massive amount of money, because they committed to spend 0.7 of their national income many years ago, and they have not delivered on that. On the contrary, the quality of their aid has been deteriorated at the service of the interest of their private sector companies, right? So the initiative might be worth exploring to better understand what it actually entails, but I would be very cautious about raising the profile of things that divert attention instead of putting the emphasis on delivering on commitments unmet. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Attiya, do you want to come in?
Well, just to quickly add to Maria José, well, I think it's an interesting document because it has a lot of very catchy phrases, and I think that that's always a good thing. But my concern also is if we only apply it in health, again, I would have the same problem about everybody else's fields. And I think going in a single direction may be problematic still. But I also continue to be concerned about very much the same things that Maria José has raised. And I think it requires a lot of interrogation before we can say anything more.
All right. I think there's one hand raised. Hansi, you? Do you want to speak up or share your question in the chat?
Yes, thanks, Priti. Yeah, I just very appreciate all the interesting talks. And when I compare the different panelists' discussion about the sometimes the risks and some the benefits of this kind of private sector's engagement in GPPP, I'm thinking a question is, for example, I see that Attiya mentions about if this GPPP's engagement is very single tasks, right? And also Macron also mentioned that it's a specific case for the very specific the issue. But I see that Maria and Antonia mentions about the risk of this kind of GPPP, its influence in the state system, right, in the system level. So I wonder, whether we should compare their disadvantage and advantage of GPPP when we consider the level of their engagement. So it's a specific issue or it's engagement in the system level. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Does anyone want to respond to that intervention? Yeah, please.
Okay, looks like I'm going to just keep putting myself forward until somebody jumps in. I think that when PPP started, there was a lack of clarity as to what it would look like. And I think that the first set of PPPs actually were quite problematic, because what would happen would be that the provider of capital would be the one calling the shots more over the ones who are either receiving the services or those giving the services. And I think with time, some of them have morphed a little bit. So it's my specific experience of a good PPP. And I have seen, however, that, for example, I mean, I was reflecting while I think Antoine was speaking, and I realized that we couldn't get funding for vaccine development in my part of the world. And so while we are talking about PPPs that allowed for pharmaceutical companies in the global north to actually get funding through PPPs, they were just not similarly available in other parts of the world. And so again, it's really, for me, Hansi, I think is really much a case-to-case basis, but with a lot of, I think, structural discrimination in the system. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So I think we are very close to wrapping up. This has been a great discussion. So I will let Nicoletta sort of conclude with her final remarks. Nicoletta, over to you.
Thank you very much, Priti, and thank you so much to all of you for your contributions. I would like to make two final considerations that are also in a way a response to Andreas. I think that you know, the financialization trends in health and elsewhere, but now let's confine ourselves to health, are very problematic because they actually have a series of political, financial, economic, and power geographies attached to them. And I don't believe in, you know, solutionisms like even good ideas with catchy words. And catchy words sometimes, Attiya, you know, are very problematic too. This is not a good thing when you have a catchy word, because we are, you know, flooded by catchy narratives that actually envelop very, very, very violent also at times realities, even around the PPPs, because, you know, when IFIM, for example, or even what we've seen with COVAX, the construction, the epistemic around these new entities is actually an exclusionary and discriminatory construction. That's violence for me. That's something that Maria Jose was mentioning earlier. We cannot dissociate from, you know, other political arenas that are full into this discourse. So I think we cannot ignore it. And as you said, Attiya, I think the solution is fiscal justice. It is, you know, going back to tax justice, is going back to policy measures. We have had enough of these men, scholars, experts coming with their own solution. This is time for policy measures. And we have to learn the lessons of COVID, because the only one policy solution that governments were trying to advocate for using international law, the IP waiver, has been blocked, paralyzed by all these, you know, crowds of financial players, private interest-driven actors that have nothing to do, in a way, with the, strictly speaking, with the agenda around health and the right to health as Alma Ata conceived of it. Or if they have to do with it, they must be strictly regulated. And this leads me to the second point I want to make, which I think is the concern that I also tried to channel with the briefing. We are usually focusing on outcome of these PPPs or this you know, blended finance, but I don't think this is I don't think it's enough anymore. I think, you know, even if they were more transparent, if they were delivering a little bit more, I think we should really seriously look, and of course, you know, all this obscurity, what Antoine was saying is not to be seen, not to be seen in 2023. But even if they were a little bit more performative, we really need to be very, very concerned about what Chiara Cordelli defines the privatized state. I think this is a very serious thing, because if we accept the privatization of the state, then we have repercussions on other things. If a citizen, if people don't see the state, the presence of the state in various types of performances, education, transport, water provision, public health, if the state is not visible for a citizen, if the proximity between the state and the citizen, the society, is no longer there, this vacuum, this creates mistrust in public institutions, and that's what we are seeing with the WHO, for example. You know, everyone is running the narrative against the WHO because it's very easy. WHO today is, it's so weak that it's almost impresentable in many ways. But the narrative against the public institutions is precisely driven by these trends. And when you have mistrust towards public institutions, then someone else is going to cover the gap. And I'm sure that we are all aware and all concerned about autocratic systems and autocratic cultures that are now, go hand in hand with solutionisms, and especially with digital solutionisms. So I think we have a much more serious concern above and around us, ahead of us, that we have to look at, even if, and maybe this comes at the expense of PPPs, even if they are performing, maybe they remain not the best solution if you look at the political arena and the political outcome in a longer perspective. That's for further reflections, I guess, but this would be my last words. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think G2H2 is preparing for the next event. It was a great conversation and my pleasure to speak to all of you.